Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. This is your host, Howard Fox. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration and enjoyment of the great outdoors. Our guest today is Ethan Gallogly. Ethan is an outdoor enthusiast, hiker, professor, and author of The Trail. The Trail is more than just a novel about hiking that details the origins of the John Muir Trail, a 211-mile trail spanning the rooftop of the Sierra Nevada from Yosemite Valley to Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the continental United States. The trail is also an interpretation of the hero's journey, which invites the reader to explore how nature can help us to rediscover what's missing in our lives. Ethan, it is a pleasure to have you join us on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. I'm very happy to be here.
Fantastic. And I in the spirit of full disclosure, I have to share, I have interviewed a lot of authors before on the podcast, whether it's the Outdoor Adventure Series or Success Insight. I don't often get to read the entire book. And I'm often offered a copy of it, mostly it's electronic. But I have to say, I could not put The Trail down. And it reminded me of the importance of nature. And it's more than just going out into nature with a mission, but it's a journey both internally and just really to enjoy what's available to us here in the U.S. And so again, congratulations on the book, and let's talk about it, okay?
Thanks, Howard. And thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the trail, could you share with our listeners a little bit about your background and how you got involved with hiking and really coming to write a novel like this?
Sure. Well, as a kid, I used to do camping with my folks. I used to do some car camping and stuff. And when I moved to California for graduate school, I was living up in Davis, and I took a trip with a friend to Yosemite for the first time. And I was blown away just by the sheer majesty of it, the granite walls, the waterfalls. It, like Muir said, it was like standing in God's temple. And I saw the half dome, and I thought to myself, gosh, I've got to climb that. I've got to check out the backcountry here. I saw some backpackers, and the next year I went out, I bought myself a backpack. I got an old book, classic, called Backpacking One Step at a Time. And I probably did half of everything wrong, and my pack was way too heavy. But I went in, I did I think a 7-8 day backpacking trip, climbed the half dome, and just fell in love with wilderness. And after that trip, I tried to get out as many weekends and summers as I could into the Sierra, into the wilderness. And it's been 30 years and I haven't stopped backpacking. I love it. And I was a backpacking leader for a while for the Sierra Club and the Berkeley Hiking Club. And it's just fantastic. I love it out there in nature. Have you done much camping or hiking?
I was just going to share it, and I appreciate you asking me this because I usually share in the spirit of full disclosure. I grew up in an urban setting in the Midwest in the Detroit suburbs, and I lived a lot of my life in Chicago. And my hiking was limited to a couple hours here and there. Now, since I moved to Nevada, I live in southern Nevada now, I have gone car camping, and I know you speak a little bit about that in the book, and I appreciate that you've done some car camping. But I haven't experienced extended outdoor activity. And the one thing that I got from this book is like, I mean, I don't think health-wise, not that I'm in bad health, but I'm not exactly your specimen, okay, of good health. And I kept thinking as I'm reading this book, because you went on a 20-day hike. Well, that's what the book kind of walks us through.
It's 28 days. And
yeah, 28 days.
Yeah, that's exactly how long my first John Muir Trail trip was.
Yeah. I would love to just get out like on a day hike or a 2-day hike and just start to build up, because to get away from the trailhead where the cars are parked, where the tents are located, people car camping, and to even walk some miles into the backcountry, I just think that has to be fascinating.
Yep. Yep. So there's something. So thanks, Howard. Yeah. I think car camping, you're right. It's a lot of fun, and it's quite nice just to get away and have a barbecue, and in Nevada, particularly sleep under the stars. You guys have amazing stars out there because there aren't so many city lights. Once you get out of, say, a Vegas or something and into, you must be pretty close to Zion.
Yes, we
I,
do. Yes, do have Zion, Death Valley, which is one of the
yep.
dark sky centers of the universe. But I mean, I could just imagine being up on in the John Muir Trail, seeing those stars. But what's that experience, that how you went from that car camping into the full multi-day, hiking experience?
So the thing about, well, first, the thing about backpacking is I would not start with a 28-day hike. I definitely would not. When I started, yeah, I was in my 20s, and was ambitious, and I set out on a 10-day hike, and I cut it short a couple of days because I hurt my foot on that particular trip. But I would just start out, like you say, on a weekend hike. I wouldn't go overly ambitious. I would maybe get a pack together and carry it in, and some of your car camping gear, and just see how it goes. The thing about camping and backpacking is, compared to a day hike, is you really let things go. The beauty is, if you're going out on a hike, in the back of your mind is, well, I got to get back to my car. I got to get back to home. I got to cook dinner. I've got work to do, whatever's in your head. But when you're going out on a camping trip, and particularly a backpack, everything you need is with you. That night, you're going to be outside. There's nothing to trouble you until the day after or whatever. So you get out there and you're just free. And it's a complete relaxation into nature. And then nature is extremely healing. As you, from the book, Gil goes through essentially a healing process, as does Sid, the other main character. And nature is that way. It really heals us. It really relaxes us mentally. It really helps. Now, you said you're concerned about being in the greatest shape. I'm not in the greatest shape, but when you get out there and you start walking, the pounds melt off. I've seen PCT hikers who, I mean, it's extreme, but they do a 2,600-mile trek from Mexico to Canada. And I've seen some of their before and after shots, and some of them were huge. And by the end of it, they're a little thing. The walking is one of the best exercises there is. It's what we're naturally meant to do. It's extremely healthy. I would just say, start with a short one. Go in 2-3 miles. Don't overdo it, and build up to some of the longer trips. If you enjoy it, then go for a 5-day trip, and don't chop off too much. As you do more and more of this, your legs will get in better shape and you get better. When I do a long hike, after a winter of hibernation and putting on a couple of pounds, when I go do a long hike, I start out slow. I won't do more than 7 miles in my first day because my pack is quite heavy and I'm not in condition. But by the 3rd or 4th day, I'll start upping my miles. So don't push it too hard. There's another book you may want to read. It's by a friend of mine, Lori Turney, who wrote a book called Trudge. And her book is about a woman. It's a memoir. It's about herself, actually. She started out as a plus size hiker, and she did the John Muir Trail. And it's all about her experience and her frustrations with not being able to go as far and as far and as strongly as her companion, but eventually building up to it. And the trail provides, as if you're willing to start slow and build up, you definitely can do a trail like the JMT. But I wouldn't start with the JMT.
I would not start with the JMT. And I think, one of the looking back in the book with Gil, the thought that first he didn't even want to go on the trail, didn't want to do it, but he begrudgingly did. but he wasn't even prepared for it. And what I found from reading the book, and I really want to thank you for this, is I want to get past the car camp. And when I moved to Vegas, I bought all the things I needed to do to car camp. But after reading this book and now getting the chat with you and hearing more about you and the essence of this book, I have had some podcast episodes where I've chatted with folks, Alex Sills-Trausch and David Young. Both of them are outdoor enthusiasts who think nothing of getting into the backcountry. And so the three of you, so you're like the capstone of this right now. I'm thinking I need to reorient myself to that start of a 1-day hike and just get it into a habit of doing that. And I think you're spot on. The nature is healing. And that's what I loved about this book is by the end of it, nature not only healed Gil, but it healed our other main character, Sid.
Yes. Yeah. I don't want to give any spoilers, but
We
yeah,
will,
no, it's nature is healing. I think just spending a few days, even a night in nature, lets you process things, lets you disconnect from the electronics and the worries of society, and really just be reflective in a natural way that mankind was meant to be. But, all the noise of the modern world makes it difficult to do. There's always that one more email to check or something when you're connected. For a first backpack, I would recommend you be very wary of the elevation gain. It would not be that hard to carry a pack, but if you've got to carry it up a massive mountain, if you're going up 1,000 or 2,000 feet, you're going to hate backpacking your first time.
Right.
So I want you to have a happy, successful experience. Look at some of the books like Lizzie Wank's book, Sierra North, Sierra South. I think for your area, Sierra South is probably better. And look at the elevation gain going in on some of those overnights, because coming up the east side of the Sierra, you can really hit some steep trail. And I wouldn't want you to do that as a first trip. I'd want you to go in maybe no more than 500 feet, maybe go to Yosemite, check out some of the hikes there. There's a beautiful hike out to May Lake. And if you're a little more ambitious, the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne River. There's some gorgeous stuff you can do without a lot of elevation gain. And you can really get into it without feeling wiped out. And then after 3 or 4 days, you probably will feel, okay, I can climb that hill. And you've got the other thing too, when you're up there, you're at elevation. So the breathing's a little harder.
Sure.
So start slow, but I think if you do it, you'll really get into this sport. I just love it, and anyone can do it. Anyone who can put on a pack and carry it can do it. It's not a very limiting sport.
I love that, and again, that's what I really loved about this book is my whole mindset now has changed around what I want to do. Because if I'm out here in the age of COVID, you and I were chatting about speaking engagements about your book, and maybe some of what you're doing now is virtual, but the wonderful aspect of where you live, where I live, is that nature is all around us. And even with COVID, we still had the ability to go out with our loved ones, our friends, and enjoy the great outdoors and stay safe. And I appreciated that.
Yes, there's been a huge upsurge in interest in natural areas, and a huge upsurge in the number of people going camping. And unfortunately with it, in the number of partiers who trash the wilderness and may have started some of these wildfires. So I hope people listening are responsible. But if you're responsible, it is a very healing, wonderful way to get out and connect with yourself.
I appreciate that. And before I want to get into the book, but I have one last question. I mean, we might kind of trek back to it periodically, but you were hiking and camping with the family. And I think that's been a common theme with a lot of our guests on the podcast is they started early. So they had that experience. You continued to explore when you're in college. And I mean, you and I are somewhere in the same age range. And you are continuing to go on these hikes. And is this you? Is it include the family, the wife, the kids, grandkids? How was that? How are they enjoying this as well as in this experience as you were?
One wonderful question. Thanks, Howard. I would say, first off, I was not into hiking when I was a kid. If my parents said, let's go for a long walk, I would have been all against it. But then when I was 13, I took a bike trip through Vermont and New Hampshire, and that changed me. That really opened me up to nature and wilderness. With my parents, it was more car camping. And then my first backpacking trip in Yosemite just blew me away. So that's really what got me into it, was that first trip in Yosemite, I think. Although as a kid, I did love camping. You asked about my
Oh,
kids and family.
yeah.
Last year, in order to double check the vistas in the book before it went to final press and make sure every scene is authentic, because I really would want someone hiking the trail to be able to read my book, look out over a vista and go, wow, this really is set in on the John Muir Trail. I wanted it to be completely authentic. So I rewalked the trail with my son in 2021 just to double check the vistas and of course take my son out for a wilderness experience. And he loved it. We got him a backpack. He had done some hiking with me as a kid, but we got him a backpack, we got him the gear, and now he just went to college and he's looking into the hiking club at college. And he was outpacing me, of course, but he really opened up in those spaces. So I think kids really like it. My daughter went with me for a 9-day trip a couple of years ago. I think kids just love it. The only thing with kids is, of course, it's a little harder to detach from the electronics for them. And if you have children and you're listening, my best piece of advice would be have them bring a friend, someone their age going with them. Makes a huge difference to a kid. That makes it a really fun experience for them.
I love that. It's a great piece of advice. How did this book begin to take shape in your head? I mean, and first of all, for our listeners, Ethan mentioned this last year going out with his son to kind of revisit all the stops that corresponded to each chapter. And by the way, each chapter begins with an an illustration that includes the length that they were going to hike that day, the elevation, and when you're going down. There's another word. You're the hiker. What's that word?
Descent.
Descent. I knew it was in there somewhere. Those illustrations were wonderful. And for our listeners, when you pick up a copy of the book, definitely look at the detail in those illustrations. So whoever your illustrator was, and I know we'll include a backlink in our show notes, he did a wonderful job. And I just want to commend you for that. So
Let me jump in right there,
okay.
Howard. Thanks for that comment. And the person who would really thank you for that is Jeremy Ashcroft of the UK. He's a professional mountain illustrator and cartographer. He's very active in the John Muir Trail groups, which is where I met him. And you're right, he did a fantastic job. And what I wanted with this book was so that a reader who cannot read a topo map or one of these specialty maps for hiking could still visualize the terrain and understand what that day involved. And so he did these beautiful 3D renderings of the terrain day by day so a person can follow along and see them. And I love how they came out. And then he also did these black and white sketches of iconic scenery like the Muir Hut and the Rock Monster. So it's got a very traditional feel, like the old 1800s books, right? You opened up Treasure Island and there was the treasure map. And I just love that feeling. So the kudos to Jeremy Ashcroft. You did a wonderful job. And the cover too. I loved how the cover came out. That was Faith Rum, who was a wilderness and interpretive ranger before she became an artist. And she's a Yosemite artist who did the cover of the book and has a whole series of paintings on her website of the JMT. So I got very fortunate in the people I worked with on this book.
Definitely that. Definitely. And again, for our listeners, you do have to check it out. It's pretty special. So without me interrupting you, how did you get from this idea of the JMT to there's a book here I want to write?
Sure. That's a great question, Howard. When I was 50, I'd done all this backpacking, but I'd never done the JMT. And I knew of it, but it was a little bigger chunk than I'd ever kind of bit off. So when I was 50, I decided I want to do this hike. And I couldn't find anyone to go with me for a month, but my friend Joey was able to go with me for 2 weeks. My wife, who could only get 2 weeks off, agreed to do kind of a swap. So halfway through, she rode in on horseback and Joey rode out on the horse she rode in on. So halfway through, we swapped, but I stayed out in the wilderness for the full 28 days. And it was amazing. It was transformational. When I got back home, I could not get the trail out of my head. I mean, my wife and I, we went for a massage. You can imagine your legs get tired after 28 days on trail. You want to unwind. And the only thing going through my head was day by day images of that trip. And I wanted to share that experience with people. And I teach at a small college here, and I scheduled a lecture to talk about my experience on the JMT. And as a college professor, of course, I started researching the history. I hadn't known anything about the history really when I'd hiked it, but the history is fascinating. I learned about all the early explorers and the names of the places and all that. And I was looking forward to sharing it, but the lecture got canceled. And that was probably the most fortuitous canceling of a lecture. Somebody else took the time spot, some important guest. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do with all this material? I've got all this interesting history. I've got this experience I want to share. I want other people to understand just how amazing this is. And I thought, I'm going to write a book. I'd already written one book, and I thought this would be a great book, but I can't write a history book, because if I write a history book of the JMT, it's not going to reach many people. So I thought the best way to do this is write a novel, incorporate my experiences, my personal day by day, the people I've met, the things I've seen, but turn it into a novel and incorporate the elements of history into the book. And so that was the birth of the book. That I just couldn't get the trail out of my head. And I really wanted to share the experience and what I'd learned about the history.
Yeah, and I love the interspersing of the journey that the hero, the guide are going on, and then the bringing in the elements of how the peaks were named, who was the first to begin the exploration, how they persevered. In a lot of cases, they had to persevere. Some had to turn back, and next year they started again. The creation of the naming of the mountains and the lakes, and I thought it was interesting. The mountains are named after guys, and the lakes are named after women. I think I've got that right.
Almost all of them.
Almost
yes,
all.
It's an old tradition, and there are some exceptions. It's kind of nice to see now, but that's the old tradition.
And I also appreciated how politics often reared its ugly head, even as these, explorations and these accomplishments are being recorded. The history goes the victor, or there's whatever that old adage is. I mean, somebody gets the name, and it was just phenomenal. And how did the decision to come up with the hero's journey? So you had Gil, who is the hero in a sense, is struggling with something, needs to go on a journey.
I call him the proagonist.
Proagonist. And by the way, I think I shared before we actually started the podcast. Yeah, I struggled with Gil. Okay. I don't know if he and I would be friends, but I liked Sid. Sid was the guide, so to speak. And I liked him. He would have been fun because I loved his stories, because he was always telling these great stories. And so how did you come up with this style of novel where you're interspersing this journey of these two individuals with the history? How did that story actually come up?
Well, you're right about Gil. Gil is quite brash. He's sort of an unhero. He doesn't want to go. He's just living a kind of hedonistic, wasted time in LA lifestyle. And I wanted a character like that who was not completely likable at the beginning and who really undergoes a transformation through nature, because by making Gil perhaps a little more extreme than most people would be, I think it really shows the change of nature and the change of being with an older partner too. I think there's a lot to be learned from mentorship, from being with a Sid, from somebody who is patient and takes the time to go with you. I think you benefit a lot from that kind of relationship. And so for me, it was kind of natural to picture this younger guy. I guess as a college professor, I have a lot of students like that who I watch grow up over the course of a year. And I think it was very natural for me to put them together as a story. And of course, Sid, being himself a college professor, and he's a Berkeley philosophy professor, so I'm able to bring in a bunch of philosophy and quotations and stuff through that. And I myself had taught at Berkeley for a couple of years, so I'm familiar with a lot of his background. A lot of Sid's character is channeled through my own experiences. I think with him, he was the perfect narrator for telling those stories of the history. Yeah, he's fascinated with the history and he's kind of obsessed with it. And so him telling sort of campfire stories of history was just very natural. And Gil, at first, he's not quite into it, but over time, he's drawn into this very human thing about just having, like we're doing now, a conversation and just human interaction. I think Gil starts to realize how important that is in our lives. So it all felt very natural to me when I was writing it.
And let's chat a little bit about some of the supporting characters. And
Yeah.
first of all, and I should have asked this even before we started.
Can I jump in for a second,
Go
Howard?
ahead. Go ahead.
There are at least 50 supporting characters in this story, some more, of course, important than others. I had no idea. I'd written the book, it was published, and it wasn't until we did the audiobook. And we got this fantastic narrator to do the audiobook. And if you haven't heard it, it adds a dimension to the story because he does all those voices of those characters. And
Really?
he adds, oh yeah, it was incredible finding someone who had the talent, and male and female characters, big guys like Phil and Rena, the small Japanese hiker, and Permy, sort of the hippie guy. He does all those voices. And those are all characters based on people, almost all of them, based on real people I've met over the years in the wilderness. So I had no idea I'd written so many characters. And Jake said to me when we started the podcast, can you do a kind of profile of each character, what you want the voices like, how you picture them? And I started writing it and I couldn't believe how many characters were in the book. It was just crazy. But yeah, there are quite a few secondary characters and some of them very colorful.
When I love the hot spring interludes where you have all these characters coming together and having a conversation. This gets back to one of the reasons why I do need to explore more from a hiking standpoint is this idea after a hike, do you go into this hot spring and you just kind of enjoy yourself, you relax, there's other people coming in, the stars are coming out, and then the conversation is in some ways just very free flowing. And there's also what I found from the book, each one of those conversations had some learning experiences like, what's the meaning of life? And I would imagine the difficulty or the challenge of incorporating these characters into this journey. And you did a really adept job at that, and kind of help that you have. It was just to perhaps have your significant other or writing group, but how do you begin to incorporate these characters so that it all comes across as being very natural?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And there's so many aspects to what you've just brought up. So you spoke about this hot spring scene in the book, and that's a real place. I mean, everywhere in the book is real. That's Iva Bell Hot Springs. And that's a place as a beginning backpacker, if you're willing to take about a 4-day trip, you could take 2 days to get into and 2 days to get out of and actually experience for yourself these natural hot pools in the wilderness that people soak in. And very often the conversations get quite spiritual. Now, in the book, of course, and I'm not spoiling anything, it comes
Of
up
course.
immediately. Sid is dying. He has terminal cancer. He wants to hike the trail before he dies. And there's a strong conflict in Gil because his own father has passed away. And Gil really doesn't want to deal with Sid's cancer. And Gil is really concerned. What does he do if Sid dies on trail? It's a huge question, and it hangs over the story. But I don't want to give away anything or any spoilers. But when they get to the hot spring, it's quite natural when one of the characters asks Sid what's going on. And Sid says, well, he confesses that he's dying, and a meaning of life kind of conversation pops up. And I've had in hot springs quite a few times where the meaning of life has come up and people have gone around and talked about it. So that conversation is drawn from a number of things. It's drawn from my own sort of philosophical readings. I've done a lot of philosophical reading, and it's drawn from conversations I've had with other people and characters and people that I've met. That particular scene is actually one that I overwrote. What happened was that scene was probably 4 times longer than what you see in the book. It just went on with each person's perspective and all their theories about life and so forth. And when my editors got a hold of that, they said, look, this scene is way too long. You go on way too much about this and that. And I edited it and I showed it to them and they said, nope, still too long. I think that scene went through about 4 editations before the editors said, well, it's still longish, but it works. And the dialogue, what I've learned about dialogue through editors and different writers and readers is if you're writing dialogue, the best thing to do is read it out loud. And when I started doing that and I could hear the voices of the people, that's when you start to tweak it into the voices, into the character of each of those secondary folks. And it really comes alive. So yeah, it seems very natural, but that was days and days of work to get that conversation, all the threads and everything to integrate in a way that people, when I had my readers looking at it, that they said, yeah, this works. And I've still had a couple of readers who did not like that particular scene, who felt, oh, I want more adventure. I want more about the trip. I want less about philosophy and less about life. But for me, I think what is it about backpacking that's so special is that spiritual transformation, that sense of wilderness changing you, and that it really is a time for reflection. One of the word plays I like to do is that recreation is recreation, right? So for me, I think those philosophical moments, those time out moments, the other one that you might be thinking about is where Sid and Gil are trapped in the tent in the rain. And that was an interesting scene that almost wrote itself. I didn't know what was going to happen in that scene, and I just started typing and it all came out. But that's another place where they get very philosophical. And I think those moments, which really do happen when you're backpacking and camping, particularly in hot springs, I think those are very much an element of backpacking. And that's actually, you hit one of my favorite scenes in the book.
I want to share too, and for our listeners, I'm not going to give anything away here. Well, to Ethan, the interaction between Sid and Rena, there was something about that interaction between the two that it's like, as I grow older, and I'm unattached. And I think in some ways, even with Gil, looking for that connection, how do you find it? And I just the bond that they developed in the moment because of that conversation and the scene, I just thought that was very special. For our listeners, you're gonna have to figure out what it is. Go buy the book, listen to the audio tape. Ethan, I am a photographer, so I've been photographing all my life. I love it out here because I get to do dark sky photography and
Ah,
get
nice.
except for an occasion where Gil took out his phone to take a picture.
Camera. Gil didn't bring a phone.
He only brought the camera. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, because camera batteries are going to die pretty quickly. Uh, there's an aspect of the story that, and we see a lot of these tourists, day hikers. They've got the camera and they're stopping everywhere, doing the selfies. They're looking through the lens and to take the picture, and they're not embracing the moment. And what I took from the book, and to really get the full effect of how nature could be so healing, is we do have to detach ourselves from the technology, even if it's a camera. And I would imagine that's hard because I guess we're having to rely on the memory that's being imprinted in our brain as opposed to the actual photograph. I imagine that's hard.
Well, I don't think it's that hard, Howard. And I would definitely bring a camera if you go backpacking. I do. In the book, there's a point where Sid talks about this exact thing and how he stopped bringing a camera because he was focused too much on getting the shot. But when you're backpacking, when you're hiking, your camera is not always on hand. Mine, for example, is in a little shoulder pouch. And you're just experiencing nature. You're looking at it with your eyes, and it's transformational. Once in a while, though, sure, you're going to stop and you're going to want to get that beautiful scene of Ray Lakes or something. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think for you as a photographer, my mother's a photographer. She's a professional. And for listeners, if you want to see her photography, just Google Fran Gallogly, and same spelling as my last name, and you can see some of her work. She's a much better photographer than me, but I also do photography. And I think as long as you don't get obsessed by it, in other words, you're not walking through the wilderness looking for something to photograph. You're just open and experiencing. And when you have that moment and you see something that strikes you, you put your stuff down, you sit down, you take your photo, you enjoy it, and then you go on. Or as a professional might do, you camp in a spot that you really love, and then you spend a day or two there just watching the light, watching how the light changes across the mountains. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's meditative to just sit there and observe. So absolutely nothing wrong with taking a camera and doing that. Just don't let it be the absolute focus of what you're doing. Be in harmony with nature, and I'll bet your pictures come out better for it.
And I love that last part of the description because I can see myself hiking to a location and just staying there for a day and just observing again of the light. And there was a scene in the book, the little purple flowers.
The sky pilots.
And I was like, oh, that would be pretty cool. And it was really fun to have to share this as I'm going through the book and I'm taking some notes. As our listeners know, I always have show notes. And I didn't want you to quiz me. I know you're a college professor. I didn't want to quiz. But I found myself on occasion Googling like the purple flowers, a couple of the birds, and just the wildlife, the different kinds of pine trees, and just really very fascinating. So I don't know if I know I've shared this with you, perhaps, and I know I've shared this with listeners before. I live above an REI. First of all, I can't buy REI clothes. They're too small for me. Okay, so I've got to go elsewhere.
Like Gil, if you remember that scene.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I found really funny is that Gil packed these freeze-dried pouches of
Oh
glop,
God. Yeah.
whatever. Now,
Backwoods buffet.
yeah, now, in all defense of REI, I'm probably the guy that's going to buy that food if I go out on a 1, maybe 2-day hike. Okay, because it's easy. But there was a lot of energy bars being eaten, consumed. Is that really the preferred? I mean, I know you get food, you have your locations where food's being brought in, you've got your container for resupply, but in a journey like, the JMT, is that your diet for the most part? Is these energy bars?
Yes. So you're limited by mass and space. And unfortunately, you've got to carry a bear can to keep the bears out. And you've got to get all your food, sometimes for 10 days, 12 days at a stretch, into that little can. And so it has to be very dense food. It has to be very calorie rich because, as you can imagine, you're burning quite a bit of energy hiking. And it has to be very lightweight. So these dehydrated meals are typical. Now, for Gil, he makes a really bad choice, right? He buys the worst possible brand. He doesn't taste them ahead of time. And he even messes up and puts all the same flavors in each of his resupplies. So not only is he stuck with awful food, but for 7 days in a row, he's stuck eating the exact same meal. It's miserable. And if you've tasted that backpacking food, some of the off brands, some of the cheaper brands are awful. They're really awful. But some of the more expensive stuff, now they've got organic food and much more natural stuff and things that, like this risotto mushroom I had the other day when I was backpacking, freeze dried, but really tasty. So the advice I'd give to you and anyone else is buy 1 or 2, try different flavors, keep notes on which ones you like, and buy the more expensive, better, more natural brands, and you'll be okay. But yeah, the food is not what you would be eating at home. It can be. I've dehydrated my own meals before and made home cooked things like homemade chili and stuff that I brought on the trail. But that's a lot of work, and your average beginner is not going to do that. For a longer hike, I do tend to prep my own meals. Inga Ashkabit, if I'm saying her name right, has a good book on prepping dehydrated foods, I think called The Hungry Spork. There's a good book called A Fork in the Trail. So there are some books you can get and some groups about prepping your own meals too. But by and large, yeah, you're eating energy bars, you're eating oatmeal. A lot of PCTers will be eating Pop-Tarts just to save on having to cook their breakfast. The food is not what I would call great, but you can make it pretty tasty, but certainly not the same as eating at home. And yeah, you're eating for lunch, it's typically bars.
Now, I what I did love too, and this is where Permy, his character was really fascinating because he was very interested in, the food and sustainability, but the onions, and
Yes.
then the folks that were doing the fishing and it shared it was
Trout,
with you.
yep.
And I mean, I could imagine it must have been so good eating that. It would have been great on a fire, but I know you can't have it in the JMT because of potential
There are
issues.
places along the JMT, if depending on the season, you can have a fire if you're at a lower altitude and so forth. But most of the JMT is above 10,000 feet, and
Right.
most of the JMT is fire restricted.
Okay.
But you can cook trout in your camping stove. There are ways to do that. And the trout out there is fantastic. If you're going to go out into the Sierra, bring a fishing pole. You need a license, but definitely they're easy to catch, particularly in the rivers. They're just hungry for food, I guess. And you just pull them out of the water and it is the greatest thing. They are just so tasty up there, particularly after a long hike. So yeah, trout is a wonderful thing. And Permy's a hilarious character, young wilderness hippie, learning foraging out there. And so when Gil meets him, he's picking these wild onions, and Yeah, I mean, if you know your plants, there are a lot of things. It's a gray area in terms of regulations, but you can certainly harvest wild onions and other things out there in the wilderness and just add them to your food, spice them up a little bit. I know I've enjoyed onions many times, so they're out there, and they're not, by the way, the listeners may be thinking of the round onions. They're much more like the Asian green onions or scallions.
Okay.
They're not the bulbous onions that
Gotcha.
that you may be thinking of.
Gotcha. One of the last scenes in the book where
No
Sid is,
spoilers.
no spoilers. One of the last scenes in the book, they've reached the pinnacle, Mount Whitney. And I think there's something about the end of the trail and just sitting there observing it. And what was it like for you when you first reached the top? And there in front of you is this, I mean, you're on the largest peak in continental North America, in the US. What was it like for you being up there?
Well, it on the JMT, it wasn't my first summit of Whitney. I'd been up Whitney twice before,
Yeah.
but it was a whole different thing emotionally on the JMT because I had just walked there from Yosemite. And for those who don't know, it's about a 211-mile walk from Yosemite over 7 major passes, all at about a third of it above 10,000 feet. So it's quite the trek, quite the journey. And I got there, and when I reached Whitney and I saw the sign for the end of the JMT, I cried. I was so emotional having walked all that way to the summit of Whitney and having climbed up there. It was a very emotional moment for me. And then, yeah, looking back on everything, yeah, my wife was with me. And when she reached the summit, we sat and looked back, and you could just see peak after peak rolling in the distance. But that initial, I've just walked the JMT, was just a really emotional moment.
That's fantastic. And the first time I ventured out to Mojave National Preserve, I mean, except for a couple bumps, it's hot, but it's hikeable. But just when I was out there, we were going to be shooting the Milky Way, and just around midnight, the Milky Way is finally rising, and it's just like once your eyes can adjust, there's all these stars, and so it was like an oh wow moment for me. So I could imagine for a Sid in the book, for yourself, or for anyone else for that matter, when you're at the end, the top, and if you have a chance even to spend the night up there, just you're like at the top of the world. It's got to be just the most wonderful experience and feeling.
Yeah, camping on top of a mountain is different. It's quite amazing. Now you have to watch the weather.
Yeah.
You better make sure it's clear skies.
Right.
You don't want to be caught up there in lightning. But yeah, there's something spiritual about being on top of a mountain. And I think long before any of these explorers came out to the mountains, of course, there were the Native Americans, and was sacred to the Paiute people. It was considered I think the old man, and Sid talks about that. But you would have natives go on vision quests and spiritual journeys where they would go up a mountain, and it's quite an experience. And I think we feel something of that today when we sit on a mountaintop and we've walked all the way there and all we have is what we need with us. It's quite a feeling.
Very good. Very good. Now that you obviously are an accomplished novelist, an award-winning novelist for that matter, you've been included in Kirkus Review's Best Books of 2021, recommended by the Midwest Book Review, and the proverbial you've made it when you're a 5-star review from Reader's Views. What are your other readers besides myself? Because I'm a fan. I had a wonderful time with the book. What are the other readers saying about their experience of joining you on this journey via the book?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think if you want to read, you can go to, I think Amazon has the most reviews, and you can read through what people are saying. I've been blown away by some of the things people wrote. One review I think really struck me was like being there is what they wrote, and how they were no longer able, they're basically physically unable to get out into the mountains, but they had done hiking when they were younger. And they just described how the book brought them back to those scenes. And I think the thing that surprised me most was particularly Kirkus, but how many people praised my descriptions, the descriptions of nature. And for me as a writer, that's what I struggled with most. It was, okay, I'm standing in this spot. It is gorgeous. It's just taking your breath away. It's like being inside God's workshop. It's unbelievably majestic. How do you translate that in the paper? And I struggled with that. I read as much John Muir as I could because he was probably the best at doing that of anyone. And I did my best to convey it. And apparently I did okay. The reviewers and everyone seemed to like it. But for me, I feel like I only captured a sliver of what it feels like to be standing in these places. So, I mean, I'm glad I was able to convey that, but the reviewers really seemed to like it. But I've got to tell you, you and your listeners, if you can, have got to get out to these places and stand there yourself. It's spiritual. It's unbelievable, the sense of being in some of these places.
Amen to that. Before we head out, Ethan, and this is kind of a gotcha question, and you're a college professor, so you're probably used to these gotcha questions. It's not too bad. We have a segment we often insert in our shows called Insight to Go. And we ask our guests to share a quote, an article, a book, or an insight, philosophical insight that advances the awareness of our listeners to get out and do something. And you're kind of alluding to a lot of this during our conversation today, but if you had to leave just one final insight to our listeners about your journey as a professional, a hiker, an outdoor enthusiast, now as an accomplished award-winning author, what kind of insight would you leave for them?
Well, I think the most important thing I can say is there's a quote that I like. It says, "No goal but the path," meaning be present in the moment. It's okay to have plans for the future. It's okay to look back and learn from the past. But I would say most of your life should be focused in the present moment, in making the most of where you are now and what you are doing, and not lost in some dream about, oh, 5 years from now, I'll do this. Do as much as you can right now. When you're hiking, don't be thinking about where is my next photo going to be. Enjoy where you are and what's around you. And if you're aware and open to the present, you're going to be as happy as you can be in life. I'm not saying don't have goals or plans for the future, but spend as much of your time as you can in the present moment.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Ethan, before we head out, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Sure. Thanks, Howard. So the book is available, of course, on Amazon. Just type in The Trail, or on Audible. I think the audiobook is fantastic. If you don't want to buy it on Amazon, you can get it in most local bookstores. And if you go to my website, ethangallogly.com, you'll find links to me and my history. And I think you can also find the book at thetrailnovel.com, and links to some of the other places where you could pick up a copy. So lots and lots of resources out there for finding the book or finding out about me. And you're going to post the spelling of my name on your...
We will have everything up on our show notes, including your website, the We'll have links to the books on Amazon and the Audible, as well as the trailnovel.com. So trust me, our listeners are going to be able to find this
Perfect.
book or listen to the Audible. Ethan, it's been a pleasure. I'm so glad we had a conversation and you were interested in joining me on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. And for what it's worth, we're now almost going over a full hour. I think I said it was going to be about a 30-minute podcast, but it is what it is. I'm not going to rush.
I enjoyed every minute of it, Howard. It's fascinating. And I look forward to hearing about your first backpacking adventure.
Well, I trust me, that's on my mind now. I have all my car camping equipment in my car. Now it's like, okay, I'm going to have a little bit of a shift. And because I think, well, heaven knows I need to lose a little bit out of the midsection, but just the idea of just getting out there for a day, 2 days, and just being alone in nature. And I'm all about the stars. Now, I didn't mention, I think a 2-day hike, I could probably take some coffee with me and my little AeroPress because I have to have my morning coffee, and sunrises are very important to me. But I want to thank you. I mean, the book, The Trail, opened up my eyes and really got me thinking, I want to do some of this. I want to see some of these places. And I really appreciate how you constructed the book and were able to share that. And it made a difference for me. It's been a great journey these past week or so of getting through the book. And I'm sure our listeners are going to want to do the same. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Well, stay on the line. We're going to do a quick close and you and I can do a final chat.
Sure.
All right, folks. Hey, we are well over an hour, but something, this is going to be an hour well worth spent. And just been chatting with Ethan Gallogly. He is a outdoor adventure enthusiast, an avid hiker, professor, and author of a wonderful novel, The Trail. And do go out and pick yourself up a copy of this wonderful book, or you can listen to the book via Audible. We'll provide the backlinks to Ethan's website, ethangallogly.com, as well as where you can pick up copies of the book on the various store platforms, trailnovel.com. What a wonderful story, and the journey, again, the hero's journey, interspersed with history and knowledge about the creation of the John Muir Trail, this 211-mile trail that spans the rooftop of the Sierra Nevada from Yosemite to Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the continental United States. Great conversation, and just really Ethan's own journey, as well as how the book was constructed. And I'm telling you, if you're not out there hiking, or maybe like me, you want to go out and hike, now you've got some good reasons to do that. I mean, if you get out to the JMT, well, good for you. Enjoy it. And this book is a great guide. And we also appreciate Ethan sharing the works of his illustrator, Jeremy Ashcroft, as well as the other young lady. Ethan, I'm coming off script. Who was the other young mention? Faith Rum.
Who did the cover.
Who did the cover. And we're going to provide backlinks to their social sites as well, because we want to acknowledge their contributions to this wonderful book. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. It's Friday here in Las Vegas, and I am looking forward to the weekend. I think I'm going to go on a short hike this weekend. Yeah. So we hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can find us on outdooradventureseries.com. We are also on Facebook and on LinkedIn. On Facebook, you can find us on our Outdoor Adventure Series page. On LinkedIn, we share the site with Success Insight, so this episode will be there as well. And we are on all of the major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Audible. So you can listen to this episode on Audible. How about that? So leave us a comment, share it with your friends, let us know what you thought, and do go out and pick yourself up a copy of The Trail. And until then, we look forward to having you on another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Take care now.